Welcome to Yogayama's Philosophy for Asana online course. The first module is called How We Got Here, and this lesson is called Born in India. These are the learning objectives for this lesson. You can pause the video to read them. They're also included on the lesson page. First, let's look at India, which was the birthplace of yoga practice. It's where this practice came from that's being practiced around the world now. In this course, we seek to understand yoga practice as it can apply to all human beings. So knowing a bit about Indian culture is helpful in discerning which elements of the philosophy apply to all humans and which may be more culture specific. In the ancient Indian culture where yoga practices were born, there were 4 assumptions commonly held by the people there. You could say that these comprise the worldview from which yoga practices came. And the first assumption is that the innermost nature of each being is identical to and inseparable from the innermost nature of the universe. The word namaste, which is used by yoga practitioners around the world, refers to this belief. Namaste is a statement that the innermost nature of oneself sees, recognizes, and bows to the innermost nature of the person to whom you're speaking. Assumption number 2 is that human suffering happens when we fail to be cognizant of assumption number 1, that we are blind to that. All religions, all spiritual practices make some sort of statement or statements about why humans suffer. This is the statement that is woven into yoga practices, is that human suffering happens when we are blind to that which we are, which is identical to and inextricably linked to the innermost nature of the universe. Assumption 3 is that until identity shifts from ego-based, that is thinking that we are separate from and unique to the rest of the world, until identity shifts from that to understanding that our innermost essence is the same as that of all beings and of the universe, we are bound to repeat cycles of suffering that originate from that blindness. And assumption number 4 is that human existence only becomes tolerable when identity has shifted to the unchanging innermost nature of all beings and of the universe. We'll look into this in great detail in this course. This is just an overview of what the culture was like that this came from, and you'll see that this is also woven into the yoga philosophy of Patanjali. Something that is unique to India is the caste system. It's an inherited social stratification system. It divides society into 4 layers: the Sudras, the Vaishyas, the Kshatriyas, and the Brahmins. Service providers and artisans, farmers and traders, administrators and warriors, and priests and teachers. The word caste is an English word. The system in India is referred to as varna. And that's good to know because varna means the outward appearance of something, or a cloak or other enveloping garment. And this is our first example of discernment. Discernment is a term that we'll look at and apply and use over and over in this course, as it's fundamental to the philosophy of Patanjali. And so here is discernment between that which is cultural and that which is human. The caste system was a cultural arrangement made so society could function in India. The name for it, Varna, implies that beneath the visible surface, though, people are all the same. So let's look at the Brahmin class. The Brahmins acted as liaisons between humans and the accepted definition of God at the time. So their job was to attain the highest spiritual knowledge that they could and then engage in ritual and other practices for the society so that they could serve the community and attain wisdom. So they lived a spiritual life and they performed the rituals for the culture that were necessary around that. Brahmins went into deep states of meditation and they gained insight into the worldview that is expressed in the Vedas. That's a set of texts that we'll look at in a moment, and the practices and texts that followed the Vedas. There are 4 Vedas. The word Veda means knowledge. The Vedas are the oldest known Sanskrit texts in Hinduism. They're believed to be apurushaya, which means not from man. They're primordial. They are considered to be shruti. Shruti is divine wisdom, or that which is heard, versus smriti, which is that which is remembered. So it's important to understand the difference between shruti, divine wisdom, and smriti, which is more like intelligence and information. What you're getting from this course is smriti, is information where words and concepts have been applied, things have been compartmentalized and divided up. But shruti, divine wisdom, is something that can only be experienced, because as soon as we apply words to it, it becomes smriti. So shruti can be talked about, but then it's not shruti anymore. The Vedas are instructions for and discussions of the rituals and practices of the Brahmin priests. Throughout them, they refer to a specific worldview which was seen while in deep meditation. They were comprised between 1500 and 1000 BCE, and they were orally transmitted, which was the tradition and still is the tradition with most Indian study of sacred texts. They were probably not written down until just about 100 BCE, and they are in Sanskrit. Let's take a moment to talk about Sanskrit. It's important to understand that Sanskrit means a refined or polished language. It has been used as the spoken language in some times and places, but mostly it's used for sacred study. And the reason for that is, in that use, it is carefully preserved, unlike most living languages, so that the meaning does not change. And that is because it discusses things, concepts about the human condition and the universe that will never change. So it's important to understand that we preserve Sanskrit. We use the words in the way they've always been used because we're discussing concepts that don't change. This is different from a living language like the one I'm speaking now, English, which changes fairly constantly based on the changing culture that it's serving. Sanskrit does not do that. Here's an example of a Yoga Sutra, from the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, which this course teaches. It states that yoga practice requires 3 things. So this is an example of a sutra. The sutras are not part of the Vedas. Let's go back and look, now that we've discussed Sanskrit, what the Vedas are. So the worldview expressed in the Vedas is supported by recent discoveries in science, in quantum mechanics. And this is very interesting and fundamental to giving the lessons from yoga philosophy some reason, perhaps, for the modern human to really look at them. Because what the Brahman saw and wrote down in the Vedas, thousands of years later, as we're able to look at the subatomic world that quantum science allows us to peer into, we're seeing that what the Brahman saw is actually how the universe is constructed. So let's compare the two. First, physics, classical physics, was based on using established knowledge to predict outcomes, and it all worked very well until we started looking at things that are smaller than atoms. And then some things happened that we weren't really able to predict. We saw some surprises. Quantum mechanics is about what happens on a subatomic level. And unlike classical physics, we don't really know how or why, but we found that on the subatomic level, quanta, or units of energy, do some strange things. So one thing that we know from quantum physics is that a particle can be in more than one place at a time, unless we are attempting to measure it, and then it is more stable. Comparatively, what the Vedas say is that the human mind seeks to compartmentalize elements of experience into discrete solid states, but that conflicts with reality, which is ever-shifting and all things at once. So this mirrors what quantum physics has taught us about subatomic function. From quantum physics, we know that objects that we label as separate are actually somehow unified, and we've seen that particles can transmit information instantly over any distance. That is modern science, but what the ancient wisdom of the Vedas states, which supports modern science, is that humans tend to define a range of potential that is limited by time and space. However, the reality is that that limitation is only in our mind, and that we can transcend those limitations. What we know from quantum physics is that observation of a thing changes how it behaves. Constantly changing waveforms behave like particles when we observe them. This was an experiment that actually was the beginning of quantum physics, is that we sought to observe waveforms, and while observing them, they behaved like particles. But when we stopped observing them, they behaved again like waveforms. What the Vedas say is that the mind manufactures smriti, that which is remembered, by verbalizing experiences into discretionary units, but that experience itself is infinite and unbound. So the human mind tries to make a particle form out of that which is actually an ever-changing wave. The Upanishads are another collection of texts. They were composed later, between 1000 BCE and 100 BCE. The word Upanishad means to sit down near, and that refers to the oral tradition in which it was taught. There are over 200 Upanishads. The main difference between them and the Vedas is that they were more about the wisdom, how the wisdom of the Vedas played out on a day-to-day basis in human life. The Vedas basically expressed what the universe was. The Upanishads told us what to do about it. A pluralism of worldviews is expressed in the Upanishads. They contain the first documented explanation of the practice and meaning of pranava, which is the Om sound, among many other things. Important for our course is to understand that they also explain the concept of Brahman and Atman. Brahman is the universal soul. So in the beginning of the lesson, when we discussed the first assumption, is that the innermost nature of the universe is indistinguishable from the innermost nature of the individual. Brahman is that universe, the universe's innermost nature, the ultimate reality of the universe. And Atman is that individual part of that is within each being. They can be labeled as separate, but they actually are not. Often water is used to express this, that a drop of water is an individual thing, but put into a large body of water, it is indistinguishable from that body of water, although it is still a drop. Patanjali lived probably during the time that the Upanishads were written, about 300 BCE. He is credited with composing the Yoga Sutras, among other works, and it is the Yoga Sutras that this course covers in depth.